Okay, let's learn about something fun. We were learning about core JavaScript fundamentals like hoisting, anonymous functions, immediately invoked function expressions, scope, things like that. All very important things, but admittedly, they're not the funnest things to learn. So let's change that. Let's learn about an event listener. Event listeners are, I was about to say hilarious, but they're actually not hilarious. They are tremendously useful and also fun. So they are called event listeners. And we sort of dove into this at one point in time when we wrote button onClick is equal to, something. We told it to run a particular function. And so we actually had to modify our HTML. Now, modifying your HTML is not always possible, and sometimes you just want things to work automatically. And so what we can do is we can create a little bit of JavaScript code called an event listener, and it's bound to a particular node element, or a JavaScript node or an HTML element. I merge the two words there together to create a node element. So an event listener is basically just a function that's bound to your web page to listen for events, clicks, whenever you type a key, whenever you scroll down the page, something like that. Now the two most common event listeners out there, by far, are the click and key press. So whenever you type into a text field or an input field, or whenever you click something, it can trigger. There's another one called blur, so whenever you click into a text field and then you leave, it might be able to perform some action at that point. But these two seem to be the most popular. Blur is still very, very popular, and then there's just tons and tons and tons of event listeners out there. We can't possibly learn all of them, but luckily they work almost all the same way. So we really just have to learn one or two of them, and then you can use any event listener that you want. So let's create a simple event listener that's going to count the number of times a button is clicked. So let's add a class here. Let's do btn primary. This is just Bootstrap, btn lg. And let's give it a class of JS button. And this is just going to say, click me. Let's make sure this looks okay on our page. It says click me, so, a boring button. Now the first thing we need to do is we need to actually grab this button using some sort of query selector. Get element by ID would work. We could use a regular query selector, which is what we're going to do. Doesn't really matter how you get this element, you just need to be able to select this node. So let's go ahead and create var btn is equal to document.query selector. We're not going to use query selector all because there's only one on here that we want to select. So we use JS button, and that's going to give us a button. So let's go ahead, refresh, and watch this. We'll type btn, and it automatically highlights my button here, as you can see. So we have this button as a node. And when we do type of button, you can actually see it's an object. We're getting to objects, I swear. I promise you they are coming. Now all we have to do is say btn, that's the name of this variable here, add event listener. What kind of listener do we want? This one is going to be a click, just like how we have onClick, which was onClick. We just call it click in JavaScript. And then we give this a function, and we're going to pass in the event. And so at this point in time, we're sort of familiar with the idea of dot notation. So we've got a button in here, and we know button.innerText is equal to click me, please. So we can change it, dot notation. That's just sort of dot notation at its finest. So we're saying, hey, grab the button, add the event listener. This is a function. And so the first parameter is what kind of event listener is it? We're saying, hey, listen for clicks. And the second parameter, we have not seen this yet, but the second parameter is actually a function. Basically looks like this, only we're writing it out the long way. So we have a function in here, and the event listener will always pass in the event to this particular listener. So here's what we can do at this point. We can say, do something in here, but we want to count the number of clicks. So let's say var total clicks is equal to 0. And because this is a global variable, we can access this locally. Total clicks is equal to total clicks plus 1, which is essentially the same as doing total clicks plus plus. And then let's create another element on the page that just counts, or displays the total clicks. So div ID total clicks, something like that. And let's grab that element as well. So let's do document.get element by ID, total clicks, dot inner text is equal to total clicks. Let's go ahead and give this a shot. So it says click me, and it's counting over and over and over again. I'm gonna make that significantly bigger by changing that from a div to an H1. And I'm also gonna zoom in here. Look at that. It's counting for me. We didn't write any additional HTML for the event listener. We just wrote some JavaScript. Add event listener. And so do you remember when we were learning about scope a couple of lessons ago? Probably bored you to death with that one. But this is where it becomes important. Because if we moved total clicks in here, scope says, well, this is always going to be 0. Every time this function executes, this event listener is executed. Every time we click the button, we're resetting this to 0. And this will not work. It's always going to be 1. Resets it to 0, adds 1. But if we define this globally and only modify it locally, it will be 0, and then 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5, and so on, and so on, and so on. There we go. We have a JavaScript event listener. Now this is pretty cool, but this is not as cool as being able to grab text from an input field, which we're going to do in the next lesson. So you don't have to do anything in this lesson. There's no homework. I just want you to sort of take a look at this kind of syntax. So we've got button.addEventListener. Its first parameter is the event type. We said it's going to be a click type. And as the second parameter, we pass in an entire function. And one last thing to note, before we head on over to the next lesson, we can actually move this entire function out, give it a name of add clicks. So function add clicks. And so the second parameter is simply the name of the function. So let's go ahead, refresh, and it works as well.